Hi friends, it's Lisa Hetrick. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and blog. I'm so grateful you're here with me today. And welcome to Art Exploration with Jessica from Color Me Creative, Kellie from Kellie Chasse Fine Art, and me from Indigo Jade Art, where every month in 2020 we are taking a deeper dive and exploring a new color. All three of us met as online teachers, and we just love teaching and exploring new mediums. In April, we are exploring white color mediums. You can also participate in our monthly challenge and dive in a bit more with us in our private Facebook group. The link to join is listed below. So let's dive in and talk about my favorite white color mediums. And I'm going to be focusing our tutorial today on gouache paint, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the other white color mediums I have in my stash and some of the unique qualities about them. So I do have a handful of different white color mediums. But like I said, today we're going to focus on gouache paint. Gouache is an opaque watercolor, and one of my favorite ways to use white gouache paint is with my watercolors. So our whole tutorial today is going to be focused on gouache, but I wanted to share some of my other favorites. So this Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White, I've had this little jar forever, and I really like to use this as well. It's a very thick, opaque medium. It's great for mixed media. It's also great for using with your watercolors. I like to use it a lot for splatter techniques and fun techniques like that. Here is some Hydrus Fine Art watercolor. Now this is in titanium white, and this is a liquid white watercolor. I like to use this a lot with my watercolors as well, mostly my liquid watercolors. It will help me get some opacity with some of the liquid watercolors. This is newer to my stash, but this is a white acrylic ink, and I have a couple different brands of white acrylic ink, but I really enjoy using that brand. So here are my two favorite white pens, the Posca white pen and the Uniball Signo white pen. These two white pens are the unicorn of white pens, and I'm going to show a little bit more about them later on in the tutorial. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started talking about white gouache paint. So here is how I like to use my white gouache paint. I will mix it with my watercolors to extend and change the value of my watercolor to create more opaque looks. Instead of buying a ton of different gouache color paints, I add white to my watercolor to create opaque watercolor. So I can go from transparent to opaque. So I'm going to give you a little tutorial here. So I've got two different kinds of watercolor here. I've got a Hydrus liquid watercolor, and I also have some tube watercolors. So we're going to just go ahead and start with this magenta, and I also have an imperial purple in Daniel Smith. So I just grabbed two of the watercolors from my stash to just kind of share how I use my gouache paint, white gouache paint, to create more opacity with my watercolor. Okay, so let's dive in and talk about how I use the gouache paint as a mixing color. So I've got my liquid watercolors here, and I've got the gouache paint. So I'm going to show you how the liquid watercolor and the transparency of the liquid watercolor on the left, and as I've mixed it with the gouache paint, what it looks like on the right. So you can see that you can create a really nice, dense, opaque color by mixing the liquid watercolor with the white gouache paint. And I just love this because it really does extend the paint that you have, and you're able to create transparent and opaque looks. Now look at the difference here. I just love those two different hues that we're able to achieve. Now I want to show you how it works with the Hydrus watercolor. white watercolor. Now you'll see white watercolor in a tube. You'll also see it in pans. This is a liquid version of it. So if I mix some of this liquid transparent hydrous watercolor with the white watercolor, it's not as opaque as it would be if I use the gouache paint. So that's one of the primary differences between your white watercolor and your gouache paint. The gouache is a little bit more opaque. You can see here that we've got a little bit of transparency here, even though I've mixed that liquid watercolor with the white watercolor. So there's two different ways that you could use a white medium to extend your current watercolors and create different values of those watercolors with the gouache paint and also with the white watercolor. So I like both. You can see there's a little bit of a difference here, and it just gives you some real opportunity to try different things in your paintings. If you want transparent looks, or if you want some transparent and opaque looks, or some looks to your painting that are a little less opaque. So take a look at this up close. You can see that gouache is a really, really dense opaque color, and that white watercolor is a little more transparent. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how all of this plays out with a tube watercolor. It's going to be very, very similar to a liquid watercolor, but the tube, I just wanted to show you what it would look like if I use a tube watercolor. So I have the Daniel Smith Imperial Purple here, and I've got the gouache paint, and I'm going to go ahead and mix that up, and I get this really, really beautiful lavender color. Look at the opacity of that color. It is so pretty. I really love that. That's kind of like the color of wisteria. So now over here on the left hand side, you'll see that I'm adding the Imperial Purple, and you can see how transparent that color is. So the more gouache paint that I add, the more I can get an opaque look. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the tutorial for today. I have some new Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press Black watercolor paper that I'm going to use today. This is a new to me kind of product, and I've had it for a while, and I just want to give it a go. You can do watercolor, gouache, metallics, acrylics on this paper. It is really nice, and it is 100% cotton, so it can take some water. What we're going to be doing today isn't too intense with water, but I just kind of wanted to show you this paper, and look at the metallics here. We're not going to be doing metallics, but I wanted to show you how the metallics look on this paper. Okay, so we're going to create this painting on a much smaller scale, but we're going to be using our whites to create this beautiful spring crocus. I'm going to focus on using white gouache paint as a primer on this paper so that we can layer our watercolor over top. So this is going to be a little something different, and we're just going to have some fun with it. We're going to do some splatter techniques, and we're also going to do some mixed media techniques with the white Uniball Signo and the Posca pen. So let's go ahead and talk about the supplies that I'm using. I've got the Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press Black paper, and again, you could use a piece of black cardstock because this isn't a very intense watercolor, washy watercolor kind of thing. I've got my white gouache paint here and my Uniball Signo, and I'm also using some of the Daniel Smith Imperial Purple. Now you can use any kind of purple watercolor that you have. I'm going to go ahead and put some of my white gouache paint down here on my mat, and I'm also going to be using this illustration that I have right here of the crocus. Now I've got my piece of black watercolor paper cut to an A2 size. All of the measurements are listed below, and I also have a free download link for you to grab the illustration from me so that you can put it onto your watercolor paper. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start to create this project. Now, I'm doing something a little bit different. Instead of mixing the Imperial Purple watercolor with the gouache paint and painting it into my illustration here, I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm adding the gouache paint to the black cardstock so I can see what I'm doing. And I'm using it like it would be a primer, so to speak. So I'm laying down a coat of this gouache paint so that I can apply some watercolor over top of it. So you can see me just working my way around the illustration and just adding the gouache paint to the paper. Now, this isn't a really wet on wet technique. My brush is wet, the paint is wet, but it is, you can see that it kind of goes dry a little bit. This paper, this black cardstock, this black watercolor paper, excuse me, is very thirsty. So it wants water, but I'm not adding a ton of water because I really want to preserve the opacity of that gouache paint. So I'm getting a nice layer here within the illustration, but I'm not going too heavy. I will go back into a couple areas where I feel like there's more of the black watercolor paper showing through. So you kind of see me just kind of play a little bit and add a little bit more gouache paint along the way here. But I'm just getting that layer down on the illustration so I can get the shape and the look and the feel of what's happening here. Okay, so now I've gone in and I've got a little bit of green watercolor over here on my left, and I'm just layering it in on top of my white. The white gouache paint, when I paint it on and it dries, is not permanent. So it can be reanimated with water. So I'm utilizing that concept by adding watercolor to the top of it and letting the green mix with the white to get a whole different look. So I really like the idea of laying down this layer of white first on the black watercolor paper because it does help me get a good visual of what I'm painting. And because I have the ability to reanimate that white gouache paint underneath, it gives me a lot of flexibility as I'm laying down the Imperial Purple watercolor on top. You can see that that purple watercolor wants to mix with the white gouache. So I'm able to get different values of the purple without changing colors, without having a lot of variety of different purples or mixing up different shades to create this look and feel. I'm able to do it with one color and a layer of gouache paint. So it's a little bit of a different way to think about using your gouache paint, but it can work really well with the black cardstock, black watercolor paper, and even white watercolor paper. So look at the different hues that we're able to create here, the different values of this watercolor. I'm just digging it. So I'm just adding a few little finishing looks here with a little bit of extra texture and dimension. And because gouache paint can reanimate with water, you're really able to mix the two together. Okay, so I grabbed a little bit of yellow gouache paint that I did have in my stash, and I just put a little bit down onto my craft mat here, and I'm just using the tip of my round brush to just drop in little dots of this color, just to throw a little bit of attention to the center of this flower with the stamens, and it just adds another little pop of color. Now, I'm going to go ahead and I've added some splatter. This is one of my favorite techniques to do with white watercolor. So I just added a little bit of that gouache paint to my brush and splattered it down onto the whole entire project. Now I'm going to grab my Uniball Signo. I love this pen, and I'm just kind of scratching it in over top of the illustration, and it works really well once your piece is dry. And I want to show you the Posca pen and the difference in opacity between the Posca white pen and the Uniball Signo. So you can see that the Posca is really intense, opaque pen. I love it. So I'm going to use it to create a few more whimsical dots here in the center where the stamens are, and just add a few more whimsical dots into the petals of this painting. Now I'm really digging the way this came out. I just had a ton of fun coming up with a different way to use your gouache paint and to use your watercolor paint. You really don't need to invest in a ton of gouache colors. You can use your watercolor paints that you already have and add white to them and create a whole different set of color. I hope you enjoyed today's art exploration tutorial. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel, and head on over to Kellie and Jessica's channels to subscribe and watch their color exploration for this month as well. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.